Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. By general consensus, the war in Iraq has been a disaster. The invasion was illegal under international law, and the post-invasion planning was spectacularly incompetent. There was an excessively zealous program of de-Baathification, which meant that state officials, good, bad or indifferent, were purged, leaving a dismembered state, and into this vacuum we've seen the rise of both insurgents and, particularly alarmingly, the rise of Islamist Shia death squads who are targeting people because they are the wrong kind of Muslim, i.e. Sunni rather than Shia, because they listen to Western music or have a Western style haircut. They target women who are unveiled or who walk in the street unaccompanied by a male relative. They target those who sell or drink alcohol, those who sell Western videos or video games, and they also target lesbian and gay people and anybody who doesn't fit a very strict, narrow, orthodox interpretation of Shia Islam. On the receiving end of these death squads have been literally tens of thousands of Iraqi citizens. Daily we're hearing reports of bodies being found in the streets with bullets in the back of the head. This is a very sad indictment of the occupation of Iraq and the failure of that invasion to bring any sense of stability or security to the people there. With me to discuss the ongoing human rights abuses is Iraqi exile, human rights campaigner and director of Iraqi LGBT, Ali Hili. Welcome, Ali.
Hi, Peter. Thank you.
I'd like to ask you to begin with, can you just give us a summary of just what the state of things are now in Iraq? Just how bad have things got?
Well, as you summarized it, Peter, earlier, it's a complete disaster. The situation is deteriorating for everyone. Not to mention the problem is the regime, the new regime, is not standing up for its responsibility to protect, provide anything for its citizens. So it's complete disaster.
And this new regime is dominated by Shia parties.
Religious parties.
Yeah, religious parties like the Supreme Council of Islamic
Revolution, and backed by the United States and United Kingdom governments and those who brought them into the power.
Mm. And of course, what is astonishing is that the leading party in the Iraqi government is the Supreme Council of Islamic Revolution in Iraq, whose armed wing is the Barbar Brigade, who are behind many of the death squad killings.
Well, since the establishing of Barbar Brigade, Barbar Corps, we've started to receive many reports since 2003 about targeting Sunnis, liberal, secularists, anyone who oppose, even within the Shia community, who oppose their agenda. They have lots of bloods in their hand. There is so many records and reports which is identified even by the United Nations that they have lots of involvement in the death squads.
It seems to be that a lot of the people doing the death squad killing are people either in or masquerading as police officers or security people from the Ministry of Interior. Is that right?
It is completely true. These people has been colliding and infiltrating the Ministry of Interior, which is run mainly by and even have lots of Iranian officers working within the Ministry of Interior, according to all the reports we're receiving.
Can I just pick up on that? I mean, this is interesting because there have been accusations of Iranian influence, but I understand that you, from your people on the ground, do have knowledge and understanding that Iranian agents or people are working very closely with the Iraqi government and with key ministry officials and with these death squads.
We have even members of our group who just arrived last year in the United Kingdom and seek asylum, have been working within the British embassy, and you might met them maybe. He was working with the Ministry of Interior as a communicating officer, and he himself met lots of Iranian agents working with the Ministry of Interior in Baghdad, and he said, as an eyewitness, he has seen himself lots of cooperation between the Iranian agents and the Ministry of Interior troops. And so that's a solid fact against them.
And what's the name of the Barbar Brigade grouping that's doing this, a lot of this killing? Is there a particular, there seems to be a particular faction within the Barbar Brigade that is assigned to these death squad executions of dissidents?
It is Badr, Faylaq Badr. We call them Faylaq Badr. It's been established over 10 years ago inside Iran, funded, supported by the Iranian government. At the time of Saddam regime, they were opposed.
This is when Iran and Iraq went to war. Ever since, Iran has been funding and supporting Shia dissidents.
Yes, unfortunately.
Because of course, Iran is a Shia-dominated Islamic republic.
Exactly.
And they want to get influence and power amongst the Shia majority in Iraq.
I think they have succeeded in what they've been trying to work very hard since the establishing of the new Iraqi government after the regime fall of Saddam Hussein. Lots of forces from within Iran has moved inside Iraq and basically on the south of Iraq established as a religious / political parties, working among communities, pushing very hard to a religious state looking like Iran style. And when we communicate now with our friends and our supporters, the human rights activists, undercover inside the south cities like Najaf and Karbala, they've been telling us about the horrific facts, how they have imposed their moral Islamic beliefs on even Shia themselves, and prosecuting the members of their communities under the name of moral and religious morality.
So it isn't just, an anti-Western agenda. They are pursuing an agenda against other Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and even dissidents within Shia Islam.
Within the Shia, against Christians, against Yazidis, but that's a even broader picture. But in the Shia community, and if you see the Iraqi scene inside, there is new factions of other Shias fighting between each other against for gaining power in the south, to establish a Shia state in the south, including Baghdad within it. It's just quite lots of power shifting issues at the moment.
So essentially, the Iranian-backed Shia political groupings within Iraq, their aim is to establish a Shia-dominated state stretching from Baghdad all the way to the south.
I think they have already succeeded in doing that in Basra and in Karbala, Najaf, Nasiriyah, Diwaniyah, and other southern capital provinces. They are trying very hard, and this is the main reason for death squad and killing Sunnis. They're trying to make Baghdad as a free zone of Sunnis. They're trying to evacuate all Sunnis from Baghdad to include Baghdad for that Shia state which they are hoping for. And they have talked about it in public, like Abdul Baqir al-Hakim, the leader of the Dawah party. He has stated that in one of his speeches in Friday prayers 2 months ago, 6 months ago, twice he repeated it. They wanted eventually to establish a Shia religious states alliance with Iran, just to establish a strength and power for Shia people in the region.
And of course, the spiritual leader of Shia Muslims, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, is himself Iranian. And is based in Qom, is that correct?
Iranian born, and he just moved to Iraq in 2003 after the invasion. And he has a great influence even in decision making for the Iraqi government. He's been we've seen how many prime ministers for the last 3 years has went back to him in asking spiritual and decisions making blessing for all these three recent governments.
And you know, I'm correct in saying that his allegiance and his spiritual and political allegiance is very much towards the Iranian regime in Tehran.
Well, he's I think the follower of Ayatollah Khomeini, because in Shia division faith in Islam, they have to have a head religious state figure, unlike the Sunnis. So I think the present leader for Shia is the Sistani. He has the greatest influence on all faithful believers of Shia sector of Islam.
But since 2003, he sort of masqueraded as an Iraqi and intervened in Iraqi internal affairs when he in fact is an Iranian and is pursuing an Iranian political religious agenda.
Unfortunately,
is that fair to say that?
It is true, and the worst part of it is that nobody talked about his background. He's been put on Iraqis against their wills to make decisions on their life, on their constitution making, and without even making. There is others non-Shia in Iraq. There is Christians, there is Sunnis, there is others, but when it comes to decisions making, it's always Shia to dominate the decision making, and they have the last word.
And would it also be true to say that Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani is very much complicit with the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Barbar Brigades? He may not be intimately involved, but you know, spiritually and politically, broadly, his agenda is the same.
Well, to answer this question, Peter, you have to understand how religion and state works for Shia. I've read recently a book about the Shia involvement in power decision making, and it clearly stated that religious and state is one. You can't separate them.
Whereas the Sunni is more secular. There's a place for religion, there's a place for the state, but they're separate.
They're completely different. You have to separate in Sunnah the state part from it's a different. Some states, it depends on your belief. If you're Hanafi, if you're Shafi'i, but that's a different things. But when it comes to Shia sector, you have to see that it's all come as one. There is no separation between the two of them. And to rule, you have to go back to the faith, to seek advice and to make decisions in anything, from money, from punishment, to other life, general life.
Everything
style.
is religiously derived
Involved
and dictated.
and involved.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
I mean, in terms of the way things are going now, would it be true to say that we are witnessing the de facto annexation of, you know, Iraq south of Baghdad to what is ultimately likely to be a religious fundamentalist state along the lines of the Tehran regime? Is that broadly fair to say that?
Frankly, it is on the ground. It is unfortunately it's a fact. When people lives on a state where everything been dictated by your religious head, community leader, every small community, larger community has a state religious leader to dictate everything. They even have little small courts in every small community, in every, what you call it, like a little, a broader community.
I mean, religious courts?
Yes, small religious courts to seek advice on any aspect of lifestyle.
And what about punishment?
In punishment, including, just as I mentioned, punishment, marriage, divorce, work, money, finance, everything.
So you're saying this is what it now exists in very large parts of Iraq, south of Baghdad. The state no longer really has, the Iraqi state no longer has real power. The real power is coalescing around the death squads and the militias of the Shia groups and these religious courts and religious leaders.
If you look at the map of Iraq, from Basra towards what they call the Death Triangle, South Baghdad, this is how it is. In some cities, there were clashes between the two main Shia sectors, as-Sadr and the Supreme Council of Islamic Revolution.
So this is Muqtada al-Sadr's grouping.
Support, which is trying to gain more power, to take over. Now, we have to understand...
Can I just ask, both of these are rival groups, but they both essentially have the same political and religious outlook?
Exactly, but they have different views on the invasion and occupation. Muqtada al-Sadr is so against the United States invasion and occupation, and his views is more like for the occupying forces to leave immediately, as soon as possible.
Which is why a lot of the left support him and praise him, despite all the human rights abuses his forces have committed.
He's no better than the other section, which is the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution. He has lots of horrible history of corruption, facade, killing, and just the recent 2 days there were his gang groups took over Sunnis mosques and killed everyone, massacred
this
almost
is Muqtada al-Sadr
supporters group, and so
he's also very misogynistic, very anti-woman. I understand. A lot of persecution of women who are unveiled or who walk in the street unaccompanied by male relatives. Any woman who steps outside the orthodoxy is liable.
But again, all of these people are against human and personal freedom. They don't have a vision about what we call a secular state. They wanted to impose a worse than Sharia law. Sharia law could be a brighter picture than what we see now. Believe it or not, and
the good aspects,
could have a better aspect than what we see on the ground now, because we hear now about people who are killing Christian, Yazidi, Sabi'a. In Islam, you can't kill a non-Muslim. Never. Killing is so forbidden in Islam. How can these people go and kill? Under what name do they kill Christians and evacuate them? And we've lived thousands of years with Christian neighbors, as friends, as one community, with the Sabi'a, with Yazidi, with others, as a Shia.
So what we're talking about is a particular, very harsh interpretation of Islam. There are many, as you say, many Muslims in Iraq, Shia and Sunni, who have lived together happily, in peace, treated each other with respect.
For many years. But again, when we talk about this subject, let's go back to the main reason who's behind these killings. Iran is trying as much as they could to push these groups to destabilize Iraq, to keep it in a turmoil for its interest, to make it as hard as it should be for the United States troops and for the coalitions. It's a big mistake. You can't correct it with another mistake. So it's a conflict on many powers, and Iraq is paying the price. Iraq is paying a higher price.
So in a sense, what you've had is like the neo-imperialism of the United States and Britain barging in and dictating regime change from above, over and above the wishes and consent of the Iraqi people, compounded now by the sub-imperial power, Iran, seeking to take advantage of the resistance to the Western invasion by creating its own zone and sphere of influence, which in many ways is just as imperialistic as anything the West have planned.
It's even worse, because now they see the United States government, they see themselves as stuck in this swamp, and they can't even get out of it. They look at what's happening in the South. I don't know if it's intentionally has been done to establish this kind of religious backward state by the United States government, put a religious political parties ahead of a state, and bring people like al-Maliki and al-Ja'fari. They are murderers, killers, and bring Sistani to be ahead of a religious state in Iraq. He's an evil person. He's just worse than the devil, and I can't even describe him in words.
I mean, we know he's issued fatwas, for example, for the execution of all gays and lesbians, and amongst many others, you know. And Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, despite this, is backed by Britain and the United States. And indeed, Britain paid for him to come to this country to have medical treatment. And
the worst part of it is they always present him as a moderate religious person. I can't even, when sometimes I read some of the views about him, he has lots of blood under his name. He issued many fatwas against many people. He was involved in lots of attacks, in preaching and talking about attacks against Sunnis. Lots of his followers has been involved in attacks against Muslim Sunnis and even Shia people. How can I don't understand why the United States government is still supporting him and keeping him on Iraqi soil. For what reason?
And also, I mean, here our own British Labour government allows his organisation, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, to operate in this country, to fundraise, knowing full well that his organisation is linked to the Baathist squads, who are doing all these mercenary, vile killings.
Unfortunately, yes, and not to mention one of their main key members of the Supreme Council and Hizb al-Da'wah now, the ambassador of Iraq in the United Nations. He has lots of blood in his hand. This person has done lots of atrocities, and now he's an ambassador of Iraq in the United Nations. Can you imagine that? This chaos in Iraq should stop. Putting people in power with no priorities. They're not uneducated. It's worse than Saddam period. Saddam used to bring anyone who he's in favor of and put them as ministers, as whatever position he wants. It's happening again now in Iraq. If you know someone, you will get a position. For example, all Kurdish parties taking over the Ministry of Foreign. All the Sadr supporters taking over the Finance Ministry. It's a state of who you know. It's
ethnically and religiously based.
Divided.
Yeah.
It's divided.
Instead of one united country, it's now factionalized,
and
that I suppose suits the Americans and the British very well.
Very well, because this is how they can divide and conquer. It's easy.
And we know right now they're trying to grab Iraq's oil with a big privatization program and playing on all these different ethnic disputes and rivalries.
Who's running the oil now? It used to be run by Saddam's son Uday at that time, and now it's run by Ammar al-Hakim, son of Abdulaziz al-Hakim, the spiritual leader of Islamic Revolution in Iraq, Supreme Council. So what did we change? Saddam with al-Hakim, and they've taken over all the wealth, smuggle it into Iran, sell it from Iran for black market. This is an Iraqi money. This is an Iraqi wealth, and none of it goes to the Iraqi people. And it's been 4 years now. How many?
I mean, I noticed you said that you think it's actually worse now than under Saddam Hussein. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. Saddam was a brutal, vicious torturer. He murdered many, many hundreds of thousands of people, and I was involved in the protests against him. But I take your point that, you know, for ordinary Iraqis today, the sense of insecurity, the daily threat of random violence from car bombs and, you know, assassinations in the street, despite all the terrible things that Saddam did, that was not how his regime ran things. You know, these people had some basic sense of security. Horrendous though the things that he did.
We have a high level of security. Nobody can do anything without... they're very low percent of crime. There is no crimes at all at his time, even in the hardest times under the sanction.
Under Saddam, yeah.
And even the sanction, how the sanctions were so brutal on Iraq, yet there was no records of crime, and you feel there is lots of sense of stability, safety. You can travel anywhere, anytime, in the middle of the night, 4 o'clock in the morning. Travel safe back and forth. You don't fear from anything.
This is not to excuse Saddam's brutal rule and his tyranny, but it is a very damning indictment of the misguided, misapplied occupation, which has basically destroyed a state and left nothing in its place, which means that, you know, death squads can run riot.
Again, you can't change a dictator with a state of disaster. There is the whole region is full of dictators. Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they're all dictators. Saddam is not the worst by far, and I'm not here to defend him. I'm so against his regime and himself too. But when somebody wants to correct a mistake, should make things better for Iraqis, not worse. Not far worse. This is extreme. What's happening for Iraq is so extreme.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll have to leave it there, Ali. I'm very glad to hear your reports, although saddened at the often depressing situation we now face for the people of Iraq. I hope you'll join us next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.